First story. It was a normal evening, and I decided to spend it enjoying the new GTA 6 game on my computer. I was alone at home, and nothing should interrupt my entertainment program. But something went wrong. I sat down at the computer and started the game, plunging into the virtual world of auto racing and criminal adventures. However, after playing for a few hours, I got bored and decided to download another scary game from Steam. As soon as I started loading the game, I heard a noise from the kitchen. I figured it was just sounds coming from the game and continued to wait for it to load. But after a while, the noise became more distinct, and I left the room to see what was happening. The kitchen was in complete ruins. All the items were on the floor, as if they had been thrown off the shelves. I was shocked and immediately thought of a robber. My heart began to beat faster, and I began to look around the house to make sure I was alone. However, something in this atmosphere caused concern. I decided it was best to leave this mess and go back to the computer to call the police. But when I entered my room and was about to dial the number, I suddenly heard footsteps in the bedroom. The sounds were restless, as if someone was wandering inside the room. I was completely terrified and froze in place. My phone showed zero signal, and I was left alone with an unknown person who could be somewhere inside my own home. Second story. Night fell, and my friend and I were left alone in the house after 3 of our friends had left. We decided to have a fun night while my parents were away on a business trip and had a small party at my house. We turned on some music, ordered pizza, and played video games. Everything went well, and we even forgot about the knocking on the windows that we had heard earlier. However, closer to midnight, when the fun was at its peak, the knocking returned. We suddenly heard a knock on the window on the first floor, and then a knock on the window on our floor. At first we thought it was a joke or a prank from our friends staying with us, but when we looked down to the first floor, there was no one there. My heart started beating faster, and we both felt uneasy. All the fun and joy quickly disappeared, and we realized that we had to take charge of ourselves and our home. We went to the window through which we heard knocking and looked out onto the street. There was no one there, only darkness and silence. We decided it was probably the kids next door or some kind of prank, and decided to ignore the knocks. But it was at that moment, when we returned to the house again, that something incredible happened. We heard footsteps inside the house, and they were approaching us. Every muscle tensed, and we remained motionless, peering into the darkness that enveloped the house. It became clear to us that someone or something was inside with us. We stood spellbound with fear in the darkness as the footsteps came ever closer. We tried to see something in the darkness, but saw nothing but impenetrable night. Then, suddenly, the light turned on. Several figures appeared in front of us, and my eyes instantly turned to icy dots. These figures were dressed in black cloaks and masks that hid their faces. In their hands they had various objects that looked like instruments of torture. We realized that we were faced with something terrible and decided to escape. We rushed to the door, but before we even got close to it, they began to step on our tracks. The steps were fast and merciless, and it became clear to us that we needed to hide. We ran into the next room and closed the door behind us. We barricaded it, hoping that this would provide us with at least some protection. Our breathing was heavy, and we looked at the door, waiting to see what would happen next. Outside, we heard the voices of maniacs. They laughed and talked as if they were enjoying our fear. We called the police, but they said we had to wait. Time seemed like an eternity, and we knew that our lives were hanging by a thread. And then suddenly, we heard a different sound, the sound of a police car siren. This was our salvation. The maniacs heard this and, it seems, decided to escape. They soon disappeared into the darkness and the police arrived. Servants of the law began an investigation, but the maniacs were never caught. We survived, but this terrible experience changed us forever. We have never felt safe again, and every sound in the night reminds us that horror can come from the most unlikely sources. Third story. This story happened when I was still a teenager and my parents left me alone at home on the weekend. They went on a short business trip, and I had to take care of myself, which didn't seem unusual. The first evening passed quietly. I spent it pursuing my hobbies, watching movies, and playing computer games. The night enveloped my house, and I felt as usual, safe and cozy. However, the second day brought with it strange events. I started hearing noises and sounds that shouldn't have happened. At first there were creaks and knocks, which I chalked up to house sounds. But as these sounds became more pronounced and persistent, I began to feel dizzy with anxiety. I started looking around the whole house, looking for the source of the noise, but found nothing. All the windows and doors were locked, and it seemed that no one should be inside. I even looked into the basement, but found nothing. With each passing hour, the noises became louder and more intense. They seemed alive, as if someone was in my house and doing this on purpose. My anxiety and fear were growing, and I decided to call my parents and tell them what was happening. However, when I dialed the number, I became even more panicked. I realized that the sounds I was hearing were coming from my parents' room. This was their number. My parents had to be on a business trip and could not possibly be at home. What was in their room, and where did these strange sounds come from? This question became a mystery to me, and my fear reached its peak. I stood in front of my parents' bedroom door, slowly working up the courage to open it. The sounds kept coming from inside, and they were so unnatural and frightening that my heart was beating in unison. Finally, taking a deep breath, I opened the door and entered the room. There in the twilight, I saw an image that almost paralyzed me. My mom and dad stood before my eyes, but their faces were distorted with fear and pain. They were completely motionless, as if petrified. From their throats came these terrible sounds that I heard. I came closer and found that their mouths were open, and it was as if the sounds were coming from them. It was much more terrible than I could have imagined. I tried to wake them up, screaming and shaking them, but they remained motionless. I was on the verge of panic and didn't know what to do. At some point I heard something behind me and turned around. There was some dark silhouette in the room, a shadow that was moving in my direction. I didn't see his face, but I felt that it was filled with anger and danger. I rushed to the door and ran out of the room, ending up in the corridor again. The sounds became more intense and frightening, and I realized that my house was filled with something sinister and inexplicable. My only thought is to get out of it and never come back. Fourth story. My story began when my neighbor, Mrs. Struey, asked me to look after her house while she went on a long trip. She was old and lonely, and this was a kind deed I couldn't refuse to do. Mrs. Struey had always been a little strange, but there was no sign of what would happen next. The task was simple: periodically water her flowers and take care of her dog named Max. Mrs. Strucci always said that Max was her grandson, and she looked after him like a real dog. But when I came to her house for the first time, something seemed strange. Mrs. Strokey said goodbye and left, leaving me alone in this decrepit house. I started watering her flowers and everything was fine until I ran into Max. This dog was large, rough, and old. However, when I tried to pet him, I felt that his fur was not like that of dogs, but similar to human skin. It was wildly strange, and I began to suspect that something was wrong with Max. As soon as Mrs. Strew left, Max began exhibiting even more strange behavior. He did not run like an ordinary dog, but walked as if on two legs, sometimes standing on his hind legs, and his eyes seemed full of intelligence and consciousness. I was shocked and scared. It was not Max, but a man who was in some strange suit. At that moment I realized that something terrible was happening and I needed to act. But what happened to Mrs. Strokey, and why she kept her grandson in such strange conditions, remained a mystery. Fear gripped me when I realized that something completely wrong was happening in this house, but I was determined to find out the truth and help whoever was inside the dog suit. I walked closer to Max, who was still standing on his hind legs, and tried to talk to him. Human words were heard from under the mask of the dog's muzzle. Max. It turned out to be Misha, the grandson of Mrs. Struka. He told me how his grandmother kept him in the house, forcing him to dress up in a dog suit and walk on all fours as a kind of punishment. Mrs. Strui believed he was cursed and needed re-education. She claimed that in this way she would rid him of his demons. Misha told me that his grandmother has kept him in the house for many years and never allows him to leave the house. He lived in constant fear and isolation, not knowing what was happening outside his cell. My feelings fluctuated between rage and compassion. I felt obligated to free Misha from this nightmare. We came up with a plan to free him and bring information about Mrs. Strachey to the police. As time passed, we carried out our plan and the police arrested Mrs. Strachey. Misha was saved, but he had to endure many of his own nightmares and the consequences of this terrible situation. This story left an incredibly strong impression on me. It was a reminder of how human cruelty can show up in the most unexpected places and how important it is to be vigilant and ready to help others in their moments of greatest need. Fifth story. My sister and I found ourselves in a terrible situation. We wandered through the deserted forests, trying to find a way out, but it became clear to us that our food supplies were running out. Hunger slowly but surely tormented us, and we felt our strength draining away. My sister, whose name is Emma, and I, Jake, brother and sister, were left without protection and in danger of starvation. At some point, we heard mysterious rustling sounds and screams echoing through the dark trees. We decided to follow these sounds, hoping for help or food. After long hours of wandering, we finally came across a huge, abandoned house in the forest. At first glance, it looked attractive as a place where we could find shelter and food. However, when we went inside, the terrible reality was revealed to us. The house was filled with scattered bones and debris, and an ominous smell hung in the air. We noticed traces of blood on the floor and walls. This house has been the site of terrible incidents. But too late we realized that evil cannibals were waiting for us. They were predators in human form, their eyes sparkling with hunger, but this was no ordinary hunger. They were willing and able to kill to satisfy their thirst for human flesh. We quickly realized that we were trapped and began to pray that we would find a way out of this nightmare. The cannibals were approaching, and we were doomed to fight for survival. Our fear and despair were supreme, and our lives depended on whether we could deceive them or otherwise escape this terrible death at their hands. Our lives hung in the balance, and we had to make the bravest decision possible in such a terrible situation. We decided to find a way to get out of this house without arousing the suspicion of the cannibals. We began to carefully examine the surrounding area and look for potential methods of escape. First, we managed to find the basement, and this was our first step to freedom. We carefully went down, hoping that this would be the path to salvation. The basement was filled with various objects and sinister dolls. In the darkness we heard footsteps, and we realized that our pursuers had gone down. We rushed inside one of the rooms in the basement and tried to hide. At that moment we heard their conversations and realized that they were looking for us. Our sisterly bond gave us an advantage, and we quietly discussed our actions. The decision was made quickly. We needed to find some way to get out of the house. There were two of us, and we decided to take advantage of our numerical superiority. We crept through the basement, avoiding the noise, and began to look for a way out. We found a door leading to the backyard. It was already night, and we could count on darkness to escape our pursuers. We quickly went outside and ran away, feeling the breath of freedom fill our lungs. Over the next few days we continued to run, trying to get away from this house of horror. We were exhausted and wounded, but our determination to survive was unbending. This story remained in our hearts like a terrible nightmare, and we swore to ourselves that we would never again allow terrible events to happen in our lives. Our experiences have stayed with us like permanent scars, reminding us that good and evil can be found even in the darkest and darkest corners of the world. Sixth story. My story began one cold autumn evening when my parents decided to go on a business trip. As the older brother, I was tasked with looking after my younger sister, Emily. She was only 8 years old, and I was already a teenager, so staying home with her seemed quite reasonable. The beginning of the evening was ordinary. We watched cartoons, chewed popcorn, and laughed at the adventures of the heroes. Emily was a cheerful and incredibly sweet girl, and I was glad that I could spend this evening in her company. However, as night fell, everything around them began to change. The dark shadows outside the window gave the house an ominous appearance, and suddenly a strange fear came over me. It was as if something incomprehensible and ominous began to awaken in the house. I decided to switch to something lighter to take my mind off this strange feeling, and we started playing a board game. But at some point, Emily suddenly froze and stared at the corner of the room. I looked worriedly in that direction and noticed that there was nothing unusual there. "What happened, Emily?" I asked. She remained silent and simply stared into the dark corner. I felt uneasy. I approached her to console her, but suddenly our house was filled with strange frost and silence. There was no sound, no movement, only Emily looking into the corner, and horror gripped me. It was at that moment that I heard a faint but haunting whisper coming from the darkness. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt like he was bringing an ominous message. What those whispers were and what would happen next remained a mystery, but I was sure that our night would be filled with horror and secrets that we would have to uncover. Whispers continued to fill the room, and my fear only grew. I noticed that Emily, continuing to look into the dark corner, fell into a kind of trance. Her eyes were full of fear, but she did not move, as if she was hypnotized. Unable to bear this silence and whispers any longer, I decided to take Emily by the hand and try to lead her out of this nightmare atmosphere. But when I touched her hand, she suddenly let out a piercing scream and jumped away from me. This scream was so terrible that it pierced me to my very soul. At that moment, my door burst open with a bang, and my parents burst into the house. They arrived home earlier than planned, and seeing me and Emily in this state, they were horrified. We told them about the strange whispers that had come over us, and about Emily almost falling into a trance. They laughed, saying that our fear was just a figment of our imagination, and nothing more. They explained that the whisper was the wind coming through the old window, and that my sister was simply afraid of the sudden contact. Our parents' laughter seemed so real and ordinary that we relaxed. But when they left the room and closed the door, we heard the same whispering coming back again. Now we were sure that something strange and mystical was in this house, and our night turned into a nightmare, shrouding us in secrets and horrors. We did not know how to overcome this phenomenon and what to do next. This night became our personal hell, which we were forced to go through together, clutching each other in the hope that the morning would bring us liberation from this nightmare. The seventh scary story. My story began when I decided to spend a virtual reality evening playing with my new VR glasses. These devices allowed me to immerse myself in exciting worlds and forget about the world around me. My parents were away for the weekend, and I was alone at home, which gave the evening an additional atmosphere of freedom. I launched the game and started exploring the virtual world. My VR headsets immersed me in stunning graphics and a gripping storyline. I explored ancient ruins and fought monsters, completely forgetting about everything around me. But suddenly, when I was in the midst of fighting the dragon, my VR glasses began to shake and then turned off with a loud click. When I came back to reality, I found that they were turned off, and there was nothing I could do to turn them back on. Noticing that night had already fallen, I removed the eyepieces and tried to get comfortable in the surrounding darkness. That's when strange things started happening. In my house, I began to hear footsteps, knocks, and rustling sounds, as if someone was hiding in the shadows. I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end, and a vague feeling of anxiety came over me. I began to search every corner of the house, hoping to find an explanation for what was happening. As I approached the master bedroom, the door closed in my face. I was locked inside, and my panic began to rise. Boldly approaching the window, I opened the curtains and looked out onto the street. What I saw outside the window simply left me speechless. The darkness gave way to visionary images from my broken game and VR glasses. Monsters and creatures from the game, which seemed to me just a virtual reality, now stood in my yard, alive and ready to attack. My reality and virtual world merged, and I realized that my home, my safety, and my life were at risk. Was it really just a hallucination, or was something much more terrible awaiting me in this terrible night? I was locked in the bedroom, contemplating the dark figures in the yard, and had no idea what would happen next. I stood at the window, filled with fear and bewilderment, watching the monsters from my broken virtual reality game roam the yard, separating the world of virtual horror and real life. At that moment, it occurred to me that I must find a way to return to the virtual world and complete the game in order to stop this nightmare manifestation. I rushed to my computer and put the VR glasses back on, even though they were broken. Once I connected to the game, I found myself at the mercy of monsters and creatures from the world of VR. I had to use all the skills I learned in the game to fight these creatures that were now brought to life in my real world. The battle was brutal and scary. Monsters attacked me from all sides, and my reality was intertwined with a virtual nightmare. But I wasn't going to give up. I made my way through the labyrinth of horror, fighting each creature and trying to return to the real world. The virtual world and reality were intertwined, and I could not distinguish where one ended and the other began. But finally, after persistent efforts, I managed to complete the game and exit it. The monsters disappeared, and I was in my bedroom, exhausted and stunned. Realizing that it was just a nightmare caused by broken VR glasses and bringing the virtual reality world into my home, I realized that reality and fantasy can merge to create eerie images and terrible events. But this experience left me feeling that reality can be much scarier than any virtual nightmare, and that we should be careful about what we create and what we delve into. The world of virtual reality can be a door to the dark corners of our imagination, and we must remember this when we open this door. Eighth story. My story began when I was left alone at home, and my grandfather was in the hospital. I spent most of my time in front of my laptop, trying to concentrate on studying and playing games to distract myself from worrying about my grandfather's health. One evening, when darkness had already fallen, I was sitting at the computer, immersed in the world of virtual games, and not noticing anything around. But suddenly something made me look to the side. I looked to the left and saw my grandfather sitting in a chair as if he were real. He was wearing his usual blue shirt and was even smiling. My heart pounded in surprise because at that time my grandfather was in the hospital and we had just visited him a few hours ago. I said, "Grandfather, how are you here? You're in the hospital." He continued to smile, but did not answer. Instead, he silently pointed at me and began to make a gesture, as if trying to say something. This moment was so surreal and frightening that I quickly jumped out from behind the computer and ran out of the room. My heart was beating like crazy, and I couldn't understand what was happening. I realized that I needed to go to the hospital as soon as possible to make sure my grandfather was okay. I quickly ran out of the house and ran to the car. Upon arrival at the hospital, I found my grandfather in the room and told him about the strange event that happened at home. He listened to me carefully and said that nothing like this had happened to him during his stay in the hospital. We were both perplexed, and I realized that what had happened remained an unsolved mystery. It was as if two different worlds were intertwined, and I could not understand how this could happen. This strange incident left me with a feeling of incredible horror and uncertainty. After our conversation with my grandfather, I still remained perplexed and could not get rid of the feeling of incredible mystery of what happened. Grandfather again assured me that nothing of the sort had happened during his hospital stay, and that he could not physically have been home at that time. We returned home, and I decided to carefully examine everything around, trying to find any traces of what had happened. But my house remained invariably ordinary, and I could not find anything unusual. But what I saw was too real and incredible to be attributed to the imagination. I spent the next few weeks trying to solve this mystery, researching all sorts of scientific explanations and even consulting psychics. But nothing answered the question of how my grandfather could appear in my house while he was in the hospital. My attempts to find a rational explanation failed, and I was condemned to live with a mystery that I could never solve. Time passed, and the strange incident gradually faded into the past, leaving only a shadow of the memory of the horror and incredibleness that I encountered that night. My grandfather was gradually recovering from his illness, and I was glad to see him in the house, quite real and healthy. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, when I was alone in my room, I had to think about this mysterious meeting, which left me with the feeling that there was something in this world that our minds could not explain.